I've got a quick test for you. You better pay attention, because this will be on the end of year exam. I'm going to show you 2 shots from 2 very different films. It doesn't matter what films they are, although you can probably guess. Just see if you can notice the difference. Here's the first one. And now, the second one. Did you see it? One of my biggest pet peeves in cinema has been the lazy, often disgusting use of color grading. The fact that most films slap a blue filter on everything in post and call it a day completely ruins the visuals. At the very least, it's trying to hide, and badly, I should add, the fact that the crew was filming night sections in broad daylight or couldn't be bothered to put any effort into the film in the first place. If you're not aware, color grading was popularized by Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, after the Coen brothers and the legendary DOP Roger Deakins had filmed at the height of summer in the South. By shifting the vibrant green to more of a warm, burnt gold colour, it gave the film a timeless feel to it. Fast forward to today, and colour grading has become so goddamn lazy in how it's applied to everything. You have the BBC's stock standard blue filter slapped over everything, or Michael Bay constantly using orange and blue. I unfortunately had the pleasure of watching part of Suicide Squad on a very long plane flight back in 2016 during the height of Christmas traffic. Not only is it one of the worst films I've ever seen, it's like someone puked all over the screen. A green-grey mess that's disgusting to look at. It's not to say that films can't use it effectively. Mad Max Fury Road is a great example, along with Blade Runner 2049, another Roger Deakins masterpiece that bathes sets in a gorgeous array of colour. But generally speaking, it's usually a lazy fix in post for films that are cheap and trying to hide lazy lighting or set design anyway. What does this have to do with video games? Well, user interface design isn't much better. The reason I brought up film as an example is that in the same way color grading began to strip movies of clear creative direction and often completely ruined the image, the laziness seen in most modern UI design has had a similar effect. Having worked with Unity back in the day, I can always sense that cheap feel of a lot of indie games. The default Arial font is a big red flag in how much the developer cared to make something cohesive and visually interesting. In the AAA space, most UI has been homogenized into that same bland, minimalistic look. I already went into detail about how much I love the UI in classic Fallout, that tactile feel, the rusted dials, and interface that feels like a part of the world and conveying theme as much as anything else on screen. But something like that is incredibly rare to see nowadays. Let's take a shot from a popular shooter like Marvel Rivals. For the moment, let's just ignore the elephant in the room that it's pretty much a one-to-one copy of Overwatch's UI, but it's the same kind of clean, uninteresting design that a lot of modern games use. We have the character in the bottom corner, which is about as much personality as you're going to get from this, but beyond the gold and the KO notification, if I was to strip out the actual gameplay behind this and just show you the UI and what game it was from, you'd probably have 100 games to think of. But that's enough for this example, so let's take a look at something outside the game and how most cash shops shape up. The background is just a light grey, and the tiles have been laid out as if it's a mobile game. A lot of UI artists will round out the edges to give each element less of a hard separation between each button or panel, but there's so little personality within this screen. Again, you'd think it's from a million games you've seen before, but capitalism drives innovation, am I right? This is more of a subjective thing, but one of the big reasons why I can't stand MMOs beyond the content treadmill or how much these games waste your time is what a goddamn eyesore the UI always is. There's a bigger problem in the industry with cramming everything imaginable on screen and smothering all these impressive worlds that you can barely see with a million notifications popping up every minute, but MMOs are the extreme end of essentially bad UI design. If we take a look at something like Final Fantasy XIV, it's not as bad, and the developers have done their best to keep most of the layers around the edges of the screen. The skill bar isn't as obnoxious either, but look at the gigantic health bars covering a huge section of the screen. Even without the terrible ping for for Australian players, I could only stand the Old Republic for about 10 minutes because every possible UI element imaginable has been vomited all over the screen. Certainly doesn't do the game any favors either with that cartoony art style, but that's another story. If you haven't already written a long-ass comment about it, don't worry, because we're finally going to get to it. The reason why a lot of these games look like this is because of the overlap between user interface, UI, and user experience, UX. The idea of how easy or intuitive something is to use. UX is this weird overlap of 2D art, game design, and product psychology that people have made entire careers out of. Supermarket chains, for example, literally have people come in and help set the layout of the store to maximize the chance of buying products. Apple was always good at this, for example. The iPad and iPhone were trendsetters for good reason. What happened in gaming isn't that different. In the early days, and particularly the rise of 3D, there was a deliberate shift away from weird experimental stuff like the UI in System Shock 2 or Prey. Dead Space was a rare exception for how it tried to work entirely in-world with the diegetic displays on Isaac's suit, but most of the time, UI became boring and simple. The Source engine was the worst at this. Where's the personality? Where's the charm? It's technically good UX to have nothing more than a giant white button on screen that says play, but who wants to click it? What I wanted to get at with this video is that it's not mutually exclusive to have a good user experience, or feel, without sacrificing a defined artistic look either. Case in point, Persona 5. As if every other aspect of this game wasn't bursting a timeless call to it enough already, Persona 5 Royal is the best example I can think of what good UI design can add to a game. Bright, bold colors, the usage of red and black for visual contrast, and a style that evokes the monochromatic look of Frank Miller's Sin City. There is very little in this game that doesn't look awesome, while not being frustrating to play either. Let's take a look at a combat screenshot for a moment. I'm not picking on Final Fantasy here. A lot of this comes from how archaic the systems and engines were at the time, but the static, boring look of submenu after submenu is why a lot of games seem to be put off by the classic JRPGs. Now let's contrast this with Persona 5. Prompts are exploding out from around characters, but it hasn't restricted any of the visual real estate either. The layout is clear, the camera is snappy, and will react to changes smoothly, and the UI and UX is laid out in a way that doesn't break the flow of gameplay in a sense. This continues into something as simple as dialogue. There's a snappiness to the subtitles, and prompts aren't plainly on the bottom or side like you're running through a shopping list. Options are clear while still conveying the energy of the game. Honestly, I could keep going on and on about Persona 5 Royal. The game kicks ass in general, and it's a fantastic example of good UI with flair and personality, but I think I've made my point clear. Sure, it can be a bit finicky at times getting into submenus to consume items, change equipment, that kind of thing. I'm not saying Persona is perfect, but it's a great example of how you can get the best of both worlds and make your game stand out. What's funny is that a lot of the times, even in pursuit of good UX, the UI ends up being atrocious to look at or use anyway. The stupidest skill tree ever made in AC Valhalla, or skills during combat in Dragon Age the Veilguard are two infamous examples. I've banged on about how homogenized much of game design and writing is already, but user interface and experience is not immune to this either. How about, instead of more bland white screens or just copying the latest Ubisoft or Fortnite or whatever, you stand out with your UI the same as other ways. Disco Elysium isn't that complex when you look at how it's laid out, but the thought cabinet, snappiness of dialogue, and surrealist art tie it all together and conveys a depth and charm along with the rest of the game. Following in the footsteps of Persona 5, Clair Obscur has some beautiful UI that is still able to convey a lot of information without sacrificing visual style. It's not impossible to make an interface look good while still being fun to play, so be brave and be creative. Visuals and experience go hand in hand.